Cymbeline, Part 3. Fidele. The absence of Imogen was not long in being discovered at court. The queen secretly rejoiced, for she hoped that Imogen had either killed herself in despair, or gone to rejoin her husband, in which latter case she would be too deeply dishonored ever to return. Either of these would forward the queen's aim, for Imogen being disposed of, she would have the placing of the British crown. Cymbeline was so enraged at his daughter's disappearance that no one dared go near him. But Cloten, meeting Pisanio as he returned to the palace, forced from him the letter which Leonidas had written to Imogen, telling her to meet him at Milford Haven. This put into Cloten's boorish head a brilliant scheme of revenge. He had not forgotten Imogen's disdainful taunt that she held in more respect the meanest garment of Leonidas than the noble person of Cloten, together with the adornment of his qualities. Cloten now procured from Pisanio a suit of clothes that had belonged to Leonidas. He intended to dress himself in these, and to go in pursuit of Imogen. He reckoned on finding her at Milford Haven with her husband, where he promised himself the pleasure of slaying Leonidas in front of her eyes, in the very garments she had seen fit to honor so much, after which he intended to drive Imogen back to court, with the roughest and most insulting treatment he could devise. Such was the alluring plan which presented itself to the brain of this amiable creature, but the reality did not happen quite in accordance with the design he had sketched. Following in the track of Imogen, he managed to trace her to the cave which now sheltered her. There, happening to fall in with Belarius and the two young princes, Cloten at once began his usual style of bullying insult. Recognizing him for the queen's son, and fearing some ambush which threatened danger to them, Belarius and Arviragus started to search for any enemies that might be hidden near, leaving the elder lad to deal with the intruder. The haughty spirit of Guiderius was certainly not framed to brook the uncalled-for insolence of this blusterer, and when Cloten addressed him as a robber, a lawbreaker, a villain, and bade him yield thee, thief, Guiderius retorted with equal scorn. "Hence," he said disdainfully, "thou art some fool. I am loath to beat thee." "Thou injurious thief, hear but my name and tremble," cried the silly youth. "What's thy name?" "Cloten, thou villain." "Cloten, thou double villain, be thy name." "I cannot tremble at it," said Guiderius contemptuously. "Were it toad, or adder, or spider, it would move me sooner." "To thy further fear, nay, to thy utter confusion, thou shalt know I am son to the queen," said Cloten braggingly. "I am sorry for it, not seeming so worthy as thy birth." "Art not afraid?" demanded Cloten. "Those that I reverence, those I fear, the wise," answered Guiderius. "At fools I laugh, not fear them." "Die the death!" cried Cloten, springing at him. "When I have slain thee with my own hand, I'll follow those that even now fled hence, and on the gates of Lud's town set your heads. Yield, rustic mountaineer!" But the rustic mountaineer had no intention of yielding, and it was the head of the foolish Cloten that presently paid the penalty for its owner's blustering insolence. Safe in the love and protection of her unknown brothers, Imogen had lived for some days in their cave, making bright the rude dwelling with little womanly graces. Her new friends had taken her straight to their hearts, and in especial Arviragus, the younger prince, felt for this stranger a deep attachment which he was unable to explain, but all united in praise of Fidele. Belarius noted his noble bearing and gracious manners, which spoke of good breeding. "How angel-like he sings!" put in Arviragus, and Guiderius commended the daintiness of his cooking, which served dishes fit for the banquet of some goddess. But there came a day when Imogen could not attend as usual to her little household duties. She was very ill. Belarius bade her remain in the cave, and said they would come back to her after their hunting. Guiderius offered to remain at home with her, but Imogen would not hear of it. So, with many parting words of affection, at last they left her. Remembering the little box of drugs that Pisanio had given her as a wonderful cordial, Imogen now resolved to try its power. But instead of curing her at once, the effect, as the good physician Cornelius had foreseen, was to send her off into a heavy sleep which seemed exactly like death. On their return from hunting, Arviragus, running into the cave to look for Imogen, found her lying on the floor, her hands clasped, her right cheek reposing on a cushion. Thinking her asleep, Arviragus took off his rough brogue in order that he might tread softly. But alas, he soon found that no step or voice could awaken Fidele from the smiling slumber in which he lay. Stricken with grief, the two princes prepared a bier to carry their dear young comrade to the place of burial, Arviragus saying that while summer lasted, and as long as he lived near, he would sweeten the sad grave with fairest flowers. Then, as they bore him on the bier, they spoke in turn a tender dirge, for their hearts were too full of grief to allow them to sing it. "Fear no more the heat of the sun, nor the furious winter's rages. Thou thy worldly task hast done, home art gone, and ta'en thy wages. Golden lads and girls all must, as chimney sweepers, come to dust. Fear no more the frown o' the great, thou art past the tyrant's stroke. Care no more to clothe and eat, to thee the reed is as the oak. The sceptre, learning, psychic must all follow this, and come to dust. Fear no more the lightning flash, nor the all-dreaded thunderstone. Fear not slander, censure rash, thou hast finished joy and moan. All lovers young, all lovers must consign to thee, and come to dust. No exorciser harm thee, nor no witchcraft charm thee. Ghost unlaid forbear thee, nothing ill come near thee. Quiet consummation have, and renowned be thy grave." Grief for the loss of Imogen had for a moment caused the death of Cloten to be forgotten, but Belarius reminded the young princes that, after all, he was a queen's son, and though they had killed him as a foe, they must bury him as a prince. Fetching the dead body, therefore, they placed it not far from the bier where Imogen lay, and strewed both with flowers. Soon after the mourners had retired, Imogen woke from the sleep into which the drug had thrown her. As she recovered her dazed senses, she presently became aware that near at hand lay a dead man, and recognizing the garments of Leonidas, she at once took for granted that it was indeed her husband who had been thus cruelly slain. Struck to the heart by this new sorrow, she flung herself half fainting on the body, and there soon afterwards she was found by the Roman general Lucius. Pitying her desolate condition, for he thought this lad in his page's dress was weeping over his dead master, Lucius took Imogen into his own service. On hearing of Cymbeline's refusal to pay tribute, the Roman emperor lost no time in sending over an army to enforce his demand. The rival forces met near Milford Haven, not far from the cave of Belarius. Hearing the noise of warfare, Belarius first suggested flight to the upper mountains for better security. But the noble spirit of the two young princes scorned such cowardly counsel, and they boldly demanded to throw in their lot with the British in fighting the enemy of their country. Leonidas also, at this crisis, had returned from Rome, and, disguised as a poor soldier, he fought in the ranks of the British. Meeting Iachimo, who was commanding the Roman troops, Leonidas fought with him on the battlefield and vanquished him. The proud Roman was deeply mortified that a noble knight like himself should be overcome and disarmed by one whom he imagined to be a low churl. Repentance for the base way in which he had behaved to Imogen stirred in his heart. He thought it was the guilt and heaviness of his own soul that in this combat had unnerved his manhood and enfeebled his arm. As for Leonidas, he fought in reckless despair, his grief for Imogen's murder, which he believed Bassanio to have carried out, making him long for the death which seemed to shun him. The valor of Guiderius and Arviragus had soon an opportunity of displaying itself. The British, sorely bested, were in act of flight, and Cymbeline had been captured by the Romans, when Belarius and the two princes went to his assistance, and with the aid of Leonidas succeeded in rescuing the king. By their desperate courage they drove back the flying Britons, and forced them to rally and resist the foe, and finally achieve a brilliant victory. After the skirmish, some British soldiers coming across Leonidas took him for a fugitive from the Romans and put him into prison. Leonidas was ready to welcome bondage, for it was a way, as he looked at it, to liberty. Death was the key that would unbar those locks. His conscience was more heavily fettered than his limbs. It was not enough to be sorry. He longed to die. For Imogen's dear life, which she had stolen from her, he would gladly yield up his own. When therefore the jailers came the following morning to lead him forth to death, Leonidas told them he was more than ready. He was merrier to die than they to live. Another messenger arriving with an order that his fetters were to be knocked off, and that he was to be conducted to the king, Leonidas followed him willingly, believing that at last the moment for death had come. Cymbeline was seated in his tent, and at his side stood his three preservers, the aged warrior with white flowing beard, and the two gallant striplings. A fourth was missing, and Cymbeline lamented for him. A poor soldier, he said, who fought so nobly that his rags shamed gilded arms. Anyone who found him should receive the highest favor from the king. No one could give tidings of this hero, but Cymbeline proceeded to confer the honor of knighthood on the three other champions, and to appoint them companions to his own person, with dignities becoming their estate. At this moment there came an interruption. Cornelius, the physician, entered. He brought the news that the wicked queen's life was ended, and that before her death she had confessed all her villainy, her duplicity towards Imogen, her intention of poisoning both her and Cymbeline in order to secure the crown for her own son. The strange disappearance of Cloten, for whose sake she had wrought so much evil, and the consequent failure of all her schemes, made her grow desperate, and so in despair she died. Cymbeline could not but be moved by the account of this unsuspected treachery on the part of his wife, for she was as beautiful in person as she was wicked in mind, and he had been quite deceived by her. His thoughts now began to turn with tenderness to the innocent daughter whom he had treated with such unjust severity. Lucius, the Roman general, was next led as prisoner before the king. He was ready to accept with manly dignity the doom of death, which he presumed would be meted out to him. But he petitioned as a last favor that the life of his little page might be spared. Never master had a page so kind, so duteous, diligent, so tender on occasion, so deft and careful, pleaded Lucius. He hath done no Briton harm, though he hath served a Roman. Save him, sir, and spare no blood beside. Lucius's general plea was scarcely needed, for Cymbeline, touched by some deep feeling which he could not explain, had already been won over to the boy's side, and now not only granted him his life, but said he might ask what favor he chose, even if it were to demand the noblest prisoner taken. Lucius naturally expected that Fidele would take this opportunity to beg for his master's life, but Imogen had seen Iachimo standing among the other prisoners, and noticing on his finger the diamond ring which she had given to Leonidas, she begged as her favor of the king that Iachimo should be bidden to say of whom he had received the ring. Iachimo, who had long bitterly repented of his unworthy deed, now made a true confession of all that had happened, lavishing praise on Leonidas and his peerless wife, and heaping all the blame upon himself. Leonidas, who had been standing in the background, unable to contain himself when he heard how cruelly he had been tricked, would gladly have killed Iachimo on the spot, and then died himself with grief and shame. "Oh, Imogen, my queen, my life, my wife!" he cried, frantic with despair at the tragedy he had himself wrought. "Oh, Imogen, Imogen, Imogen!" But, happily, the calamity was not past remedy. Imogen herself was at hand, and soon everything was put right. Belarius restored to Cymbeline the two boys stolen in infancy, and in the joy of finding them again, Cymbeline pardoned the offender. "I lost my children," he said. "If these be they, I know not how to wish a pair of worthier sons." The young princes welcomed with rapture their dear young comrade Fidele, whom they had mourned as dead, and who was now given back to them as their own beloved sister. To Caius Lucius, the Roman general, Cymbeline, with royal generosity, announced that, though the victor, he would henceforth pay to Augustus Caesar the rightful tribute he demanded, which his wicked queen had dissuaded him from doing. The poor soldier whom Cymbeline was desirous of thanking turned out to be no other than Leonidas, his own son-in-law. Even Iachimo met with mercy. In deep contrition he knelt before Leonidas, saying humbly, "Take that life, I beseech you, which I owe you, but your ring first, and here the bracelet of the truest princess that ever swore her faith." "Kneel not to me," said Leonidas. "The power that I have over you is to spare you, the malice towards you, to forgive you, live, and deal with others better." "Nobly doomed," pronounced Cymbeline. "We will learn generosity of our son-in-law. Pardon's the word to all."